So obviously, already throughout today and throughout the next couple of days, we'll see a lot of different ways to describe community participation. When it comes specifically to grant-making processes, we've kind of looked at it as a quasi-spectrum. This is based on many interviews with different grant makers that I've been doing over the last 6 months or so. We're researching participatory grant making. And these are kind of the 4 categories that grant makers have identified as steps on this participatory process. So starting with informing, that's where a foundation is communicating out to a community what they want them to hear. Consulting is where a foundation has a very specific ask of a community and is inviting that feedback. Involving is where the community is invited to be a part of something and maybe be in dialogue, but they still don't hold decision-making power. And then when it comes to deciding in participatory philanthropy, this is really like the crux of what we're going to spend this session talking about, which is how community members can actually make funding decisions. And I know a gentleman in the previous section made a very good point during the Q&A about wanting to have some shared definitions for participation. I think that is really important and also, as we know, a huge challenge because no matter who you talk to, they will define things a little bit differently, and especially as we have these conversations on a global scale, definitions really vary depending on context. But one thing that's been clear about participatory grant making is that it's about funders ceding decision-making power to the very communities that they're trying to serve. And at the core of this is the idea that money is power, right? And so if you have control over money, where that money is going, suddenly it's also a little bit of a shift of power. So you're gonna hear all 3 of our panelists talk about that shift of power in their own work. And it's going to look and feel really different. I think we have 3 very different contexts, but really listen as they're speaking for that shifting of power and how that manifests in their model. I think a couple other framing thoughts I wanted to say as we enter this discussion. One thing is that with every different approach in participatory grant making, there's sort of this ethos of funders that they are not the experts, that communities themselves are in fact experts. And that's something we've heard from earlier presentations is one of the biggest challenges, and it's why participatory grant making is still a relatively small piece of the institutional philanthropy pie. It's really hard for funders to actually acknowledge that maybe the communities they're serving are most expert in the needs of their own communities. So that's one big kind of framing thought to listen for. And then another, especially as we had a pre-conversation that came up for me, is that participatory grant making is a process. And in a lot of ways, that process itself is an outcome. It doesn't always matter where money and resources get distributed, but it's also the involvement of people in an actual process that we look to as an outcome. And a piece of any process, as we all know, is iteration. And so embedded in each of these models and kind of in the broader landscape of participatory grant making are feedback loops. So asking constituents for feedback. How did this go for you? What was the experience? And really critically hearing that, internalizing it, and evolving process. So even if you're in the informing or consulting part of this quasi-spectrum and you're not yet ceding decision-making power, there are still ways to be listening and learning so that you can build a participatory process that is appropriate and reflective of community needs. And then the one other thing before I flip to you guys and just do a quick little poll of who's in the room, I want to contextualize the work of these 3 panelists as really part of a growing global movement. Participatory grant making is happening across a lot of different populations and issue areas. Just to share 2 that I have pretty closely researched and think are phenomenal models. One is the Red Umbrella Fund, which is based out of Amsterdam. And they actually work across 48 or 49 countries with sex workers. And I believe the staff of the foundation is only 3.5 people. And so it's almost solely volunteer and community-led. And their panels are made entirely of sex workers. And that's a really interesting one because anonymity is actually very important so that the participants do not risk threats or other consequences in their own community. And so that is a population that previously was not being addressed by institutional philanthropy, where a participatory grant-making process made it possible. And another community where one could say the same thing, where traditional grant-making was not addressing their needs, are disability communities. And so the Disability Rights Fund is actually, again, a great global example of how it's not about funding one thing for disabled communities, but rather about involving people with disabilities in decision-making processes across multiple needs that they see within their community. So just wanted to give that global context because these are 3 of many phenomenal examples. And I'm going to turn it to you guys in a minute, but first we're going to poll the audience, who we can't see because of these lights. We wanted to just see with a quick show of hands who considers themselves either a participatory grant maker or someone who has participated in a participatory funding process. Can you just raise your hand if you've ever done anything like this? Okay, we've got like 6. In the past or now? Okay, we have like 10 hands in the air. And so from you 10 people, think as we're talking if there are examples that you want to bring into the conversation as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then set them up for their presentations. So I think first we're going to go with Arundhati, and she leads the India Foundation for the Arts, which is the only independent grant-making organization of its kind that supports arts and culture programs across India. And they have the belief that independent funding is only possible with deep engagement with and participation of the arts and culture community. So she'll go first, but I'll introduce our other 2 panelists while we're sitting here. So Menno has worked with the European Cultural Foundation since 2010. As a manager of pilot projects, he tests and investigates new models, methods, trends that feed into the foundation's strategy. The projects relate to topics like culture, media, activism, migration, democracy, and the commons. He's also a member of the facilitation group of Fund Action, a new participatory fund making grants for social transformation, and it's organized around a community of activists based in Europe. And then finally, Mika has been president of the Clubture network since June 2016, which is a platform for gathering independent culture organizations in Croatia that share a view of culture as a process of exchange. Clubture's activities focus on program collaboration and visibility, strengthening independent culture in Croatia and the region. And it's her first time on the big stage representing Clubture, so it's going to be fantastic. But we will start with Arundhati.
Thanks, Jen.
We'll just go this way. Yep.
So I lead India Foundation for the Arts, and as Jen said, unfortunately, it's the only independent, not-for-profit, grant-making body that supports arts and culture projects across the country. We are governed by a board, and over the last 22 years, we've made about 500 grant projects across the country in 36 languages, regions. As many of you know, India is not really a country. That's what the British told us after 200 years when they were leaving. It's really a large, large subcontinent of very different cultures, languages, regions. So we work across 36 different languages across the country with different forms. So we support grants that the outcomes of which become books, exhibitions, installations, concerts, productions, archival material, conferences, all kinds of things come out from the outcomes of the grants that we make. Before I go into exactly what we do in terms of participation, and I'll talk about the shift of power. Actually, there was never any shift of power because this organization was created with the need of independent funding where the agenda of what needs to be funded is decided by the community it would serve, which is scholars, artists, and arts practitioners, cultural activists. So there was never any shift for the 22 years. These are some of the processes we've been following. And of course, we've transformed, we've bettered some of them, we learned from our mistakes, we learned from sharing with other organizations like us across the world. And so before I go into exactly what we do and how we do it, I would like to give you a sort of environmental structure within which we function. So there is the state and there's the market that mostly supports cultural work in India. So Ministry of Culture and other market dynamics. However, the way we see ourselves is outside of these two hegemonies of power, where does arts and culture stand? So we support those journeys that challenge dominant narratives that are put in place by state and the market. We support those stories that are those voices that become either silenced or ignored or invisible or erased by the powers that be. So in some way, you could say that we support projects that speak truth to power. We, as facilitators, catalysts, provocateurs, support experiments, explorations, investigations in the arts and culture. So, in our independent grant-making decisions, there is no state or market. However, there are these other two worlds that we have to consider, right? One is the board of trustees and the donor world, and the other is really the organization and the arts world that consists of artists. And of course, when I say arts, I mean all kinds of arts: music, film, theater, photography, everything that you can think of. The communities that they work with or they work in, scholars, researchers, critics, that's the arts world. So let me first do away with the board and the donor world, because they really don't participate in grant making. And this is because, again, going to the reason why this foundation was set up, the arts agenda has to be, arts and culture agenda has to be decided by the people this organization serves, which is the arts and culture community. So the board looks at governance, transparency, accountability, the fiscal stability, overall direction, but they have no say in grant making. Donors, again, support existing and new programs. They help with advocacy, ambassadorship, but they have no say in grant making or the grants that we make. So then, it's this world in this black space that participates in the various processes of our grant making. The first one being evaluations of independent proposals. We get about 3,000 inquiries every year, 800 draft proposals come in, 500 final ones, of which 150 are shortlisted, and then these go out to people in the field, peers, experts, people from the community, who evaluate these proposals. There are, for different programs that we have the arts research program, a practice program, an arts education program, archival and museum fellowships. In all these areas, in a year, we select about 45 final projects that we support, but the decisions for support comes from the field. When we are reviewing these programs, because over a period of time, the programs lose relevance, the things in the environment changes, it's a very dynamic space. So when we're reviewing programs and they transform into newer programs, or there's a new need that's felt, again, voice of the field becomes a very important part of our decision making. And that decision, again, is made by a group of people, peers from the community who are chosen to decide, now how is this program going to look for the next 5 years? Many of these voices of the field sort of experiences you can find on our website, because it's all out there. And there are enough bouquets and brickbats for the foundation. So if you want this kind of togetherness and sort of working in a collaborative mode, you have to be okay with people saying things that you don't like. You may have worked very hard for it, but there may be decisions that have come about that the community does not like, and it comes out in some of these voices. So they're not always very congratulatory in many ways. Exploring new ideas and themes, again, many community consultations happen with the communities where these projects are happening, and the decisions are again made by the communities where these projects are going to happen. We also, as staff members, 16 of us, it's a very small organization, we are there based in Bangalore, but our office is in the suitcase, because as you know, India is huge and we are traveling 20 days every month to meet people, be part of the collectives that are across the country. And therefore, we see ourselves not as a funder who is in isolation, but who are very much part of the community that we serve. Many collaborative programs have actually come up together with our grantees, and the one that I will mention here is a new program that supports theater groups across the country to develop strategic thinking around how they're going to work with theater. And this is a collaboration between us, Junoon, which is an arts organization, the India Theatre Forum, which is another arts organization, and we serve as equal people on the board on the collaborative platform, where we've developed a program for a year for theater groups. Interestingly, even in the process of grant making, there are new things that we learn from the community. So we had once made a grant to a group of musicians in Rajasthan, and they spoke to us saying, you know, the way you talk about impact measurement, that's not how the community sees value in the musical practices that we do. What we understand by impact is very different from what you're asking us about. And we had to go back and change the manner in which we talk about impact. And then the additional part is go back to our donors and explain that that is how impact should be measured, because that's what matters to the community who practices it. It doesn't matter whether there are boxes and lines that you have to fill called impact measurement, which is anyway made by people who don't understand the context often. So that's a learning that we have in the process of grant making. For our residencies, workshops, seminars that we support, we don't take any decisions on who's going to be participating there. The grantees, the arts community themselves choose the people who would be part of this. We're going to talk about this later in our discussion. But in terms of benefits and challenges, there are two things that I wanted to, in each case, that I wanted to talk about. In benefits, in a country like India, it's impossible to think of funding what needs to be funded unless you look at a participatory method. It's actually almost impossible to think of any centralized system of funding, because the multilingual, multicultural voices which are there across the country would be absolutely lost if you didn't do that. So it's almost obvious that you need to be an important, significant grant maker. You have to be participatory in your decision making, not just in involving and consulting, but in actual decision making. And the second thing is that this enables us to build discourses from within. So again, going back to the example of the strategic thinking program that we started for the theater groups, this is a program that has evolved from the ground. These are examples of or case studies of theater practices that have been in the country for hundreds of years. They have not been borrowed either from other country context or from the business sector, because most strategic management, strategic thinking, business people feel that they have a right to it, and it's just imported back into the arts. So that's not it. And the third thing is that they're not development sector ideas of strategic thinking either. They have come from the ground, and we couldn't have done that unless we were building it together with artists, scholars, theater makers from the field. In terms of challenges, the two biggest ones that we face, one is the very fragmented, conflicted, ideologically divided sector itself. So the arts and culture sector in India, as I guess anywhere else, is extremely fragmented. So when you're thinking of participation, what are you really, is it representational? Is it guided by a certain value system? So this becomes a very difficult thing. The second thing is actually the board's dilemma. And often in almost every board meeting, this is something that we have to deal with. The board has limited authority, but absolute responsibility. So they can't take a decision on grant making, but if there's a grant that we've made that's political in nature and a right-wing government comes after us, we expect the board to stand for us. They can't run away. So they have no decision-making capacity, but they have to be responsible for the work that we do or the work that we support. So that's a dilemma that one has to deal with. So to end, I would say, in our context, for India Foundation for the Arts and working in grant making in India, in collectivism actually lies our independence. Thank you.
Thank you. That's that one again. There we go. So this one, this one.
Yeah.
All right. Please hold while we scroll. Great. Do you want us to click for you? Oh, okay. Perfect. Lots of things to come back to in that one. And here we go with the next.
Thank you. I really apologize in advance for my very boring presentation. But I hope you will at least find out some information. So what do I do here? So Clubture is a network that consists of 55, at the moment, 55 members. And it's based on the vision of culture as a process of exchange. I'm saying this because for Clubture, the process of exchange is at the core of what it does and how it sees itself. And one of the core programs of the network, which is different in some aspects from other networks based on membership and representation. The core program of the network is program of exchange. We'll get to there later. The objectives of the network are these. So basically the network is working in the field of independent culture, and it is focused on the improvement of the conditions of work and production of culture in that specific sector. But it's also concerned with changing policy framework for that specific part of culture, and as well, and culture in general in Croatia and somehow in the region. When I say the region, I mean the Balkan region, ex-Yugoslavia. So history of culture begins in 2001 with the program platform that was initiated by Multimedia Institute, and that gathered around 15 civil society organizations and informal initiatives and non-profit clubs in Croatia. At the time, with the vision of exchange of the programs, Croatia is a very centralized country. In 2001, it was also the country that didn't really institutionally recognize independent culture, meaning non-institutional culture. So it developed out of a need for the independent cultural producers and organizations to get together, exchange the content, and decentralize culture. In 2002, it was formalized as a network, and from 2003, it started the implementation of its participative model, which I will explain in depth later. I have to say that in the past 14 years, this model has changed somewhat in, let's say, in details or in rules. And but the core idea of the model has remained intact, and the model is this participative process. Before I go into participative process, I just wanted to say, to remind again that this is one of the programs that Clubture does. Clubture also does a lot of policy work. Clubture also does a lot of mobilization on the independent cultural scene that is not connected to exchange solely. I'm talking now about the program of exchange and participative process that goes there. So what we do, first, we are not a funder. That is an important thing. We are not a grant-making institution, and we don't give grants. We are a network which fundraises for the program of exchange, and then that fundraised money goes into the to the program, and it is distributed through this participative process. We publish calls for project proposals twice a year. And the beginning, you saw on the slide that we are inclusive and participative program platform, which means that the project calls are published for both members of the network and non-members of the network. So every year, every round, we ask organizations, both members and non-members, to submit the project proposals. assembly of the network, which is the highest decision-making body, which consists of all members, sets up a working group which acts as a filter. When I say filter, a working group, basically what they do is when they go through the proposals, they establish whether they belong to the independent culture or not. So if a company wanting to do video games submits a proposal that's not obviously in the sphere of the network, and that's what working group does. Also, working group consults the applicants on the application system and process if they lack something in their application, and so on. These proposals that are then published online, they're available for everybody to see, and everybody can go through them. Assembly meeting is set up usually at the beginning of the year, February or March, and the assembly meeting consists of all the members of the network, but also of all the applicants who are not the members of the network. This is an important moment. I will come to it later. At the assembly meeting, all the applicants present the projects they want to do, and I will say something about those projects a bit later. And then we vote. The right of voting has everybody who is a member of the assembly and everybody who submitted the project proposals. So all the non-members who submitted, who are the applicants, also have the right of vote. Now, maybe it's time now to say something about these projects. There are a lot of rules that we set up by ourselves, for ourselves, and that is the point where Clubture Network is Clubture Network's model is a participative and very important in democratic terms, I would say. It's very democratic. So basically, the rules are that projects that are submitted need to be done in collaboration. So you cannot submit your own project. They have to be done in collaboration with at least 2 or 3 organizations from Croatia. And they have to have events, different events taking place in different cities. So you cannot organize one thing in your own city by yourself and get the funding for that. So this is created this is something that has been kept in the model for since the beginning, and that is the idea of distribution of culture, of collaboration in the production of culture is what is important for the members of the network. So everybody who submits the project and all the members of the assembly can vote. We have a very detailed voting system, and all these projects are ranked. So they are ranked from the top, the ones that receive the most points to the ones with the least points, and then the working group monitors that process, and the working group sets up a budget. So we basically take all the money that we have in the pot, we distribute it across the projects with one rule that every project can receive at least 60% of the requested budget. So basically we make an Excel sheet and we usually have 2 budgets, and voting on which budget will be accepted is done by the members of the assembly. So members of the assembly vote whether we want to have 10 projects with less money or 8 projects with more money. That's basically the decision. So after that, implementation of selected projects begins, and the core team of the coordinator of the network, together with the working group, is in charge of monitoring that process and helping out. These are our statistics for the past 15, 14 years. As you can see, more than 70% of all the content, cultural content was performed out of Zagreb. What we insist on is the public character of of the projects or of the events. They have to be free. We also insist on that. And I can now maybe say just a few, and you can see the shoestring budget that we have. Mostly, yeah, every year is approximately that budget, sometimes less, sometimes more. But I will just say a few benefits and few challenges. Maybe I should start with challenges. I like to talk about problems more. So challenges, one of the challenges, and I think one of the biggest challenges is the process itself, because it involves a lot of communication, it involves a lot of engagement on part of everybody involved. It involves a very little fund. So we have to talk a lot and we have to discuss a lot. And everybody has to put a lot of energy into going through the proposals, reading them. So basically that's a huge process. It is also very competitive because for example, now we, from this program, 10 to 15 projects per year are funded and 30 to 45 are applied. So there is a big competition. So we have to kind of accommodate for that. But the process itself, even though it's a challenge, it also is a benefit because it creates kind of a very genuine participation and very genuine democratic process of decision making. People are involved, people claim it, and they are organizations, initiatives, and artistic organizations, they kind of own it. And it is very important not only within this program, but also within everything else that Clubture does, especially when it comes to mobilizing the scene, to fighting for policy measures that are beneficial for the independent culture, when it comes to strengthening the trust among the organizations, and also when it comes to involving the organizations that are, we will talk about power play later, that are very marginal from small cities, so or small communities. So I would say that the challenge is at the same time the benefit, and it depends how you see the glass, the half full or half empty. Thank you.
Rotate. Good afternoon. Yeah, I chose that music to make my presentation a bit more lively. I'm a bit ill, so it might be that I lose my voice halfway through the presentation, but then I will just continue in sign language, or you just read what's on the screen there. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here to this interesting conference. I just arrived, so I haven't seen so much yet, but it starts promising. My name is Menno, and I work for the European Cultural Foundation, as Jen already told you, which is, maybe some of you know the foundation, an independent foundation based in Amsterdam, and it is there already for a while now. And we strive for an open, democratic, and inclusive Europe, and believe that culture is a key contributor to a Europe based on those values. What do we actually do? We give grants, so we're a grant-making foundation. We do advocacy. We have an annual award ceremony in which we try to highlight some good examples of cultural change makers. And we also connect and convene civil society, cultural change makers throughout Europe. But I can tell you a lot about what the foundation does, but this is about participatory grant-making, and we have some experience with some of the steps that Jen indicated in the beginning. But recently, we initiated together with many others a new participatory fund for activists in Europe. This is not just for cultural activists, because we are part of a broader coalition. And it's called Fund Action, and we make grants for transition to a just and equitable world, well, specifically in Europe. And I will tell you something more about that. I'm a member of the facilitation group that is, let's say, running it on a day-to-day basis. We try to shift power and leave the decision-making power to the ones that are actually affected by the issues we are trying to address. We also try to strengthen the collaboration, so we try to create a community, a network of activists in Europe working on similar issues, but also working on different issues. And thereby we also build the capacity of the activists, because knowledge is power. So if they can learn from each other and exchange knowledge, then we think they also become stronger in their individual cases, but also as activists. So how do we actually do that? We have 3 types of grants, of which one we have a call open now, not a completely open call, but I will come to that later. And those are the Rethink grants, and those are grants that are focused on exchange within the platform. So you already have to be a member of the funding platform to be eligible for this type of grants, and it's mainly for exchange, knowledge exchange and capacity building, which means it could be a study visit, a job shadowing, but it could also be a translation of an important report you made and you want to translate into another language and that kind of stuff. The second type of grant is Renew. Those are a bit larger grants focused on initiatives that are supporting systemic change. So it's more for like research initiatives and projects with a more sustainable and long-term effect towards a real change of system, and not just to solve an issue within the system without addressing the system itself. And the third type of grants, that's the one we have to still to launch. We need some time because it's a bit more complicated. Although the grants are very small, those are the Resist grants, and they are for rapid response grants, small grants for demonstrations or campaigns when something happens into politics. Some fascist minister gets into the government, and you want to start a quick action to make this person resign or petition, you could apply for such a grant. So hopefully we have an opportunity for that by the end of next year. I'm talking too much, I feel already my throat, so I will end the clock, so I will go a bit faster. How do we do that? Well, the fund is built on a democratic and participatory way, and it's based on certain values that we as a group of funders and activists established together, and the values are written there, so I'm not going to read them all out. Practically, we have like a member base, which is currently about 100 activists, but we hope it will grow. We just started, it's in a pilot phase. And then we have a facilitation group, which you could consider as a sort of a board or some organ that takes care of the daily management, in which there are 6 activists and 2 representatives of funders, of which I am one. The facilitation group takes care of the daily management, but it doesn't make the decisions about the grants. That is done by the members, but also, depending on which type of grants and how it works exactly, by peer-to-peer panels, which are not elected, but selected randomly, taking into account also diversity, gender balance, etc. Selected randomly by lottery, let's say, from the member base. So it's not like election as in the most popular can get to choose who gets the funding, but it's random. why do we do this, actually? Well, as you all know, most philanthropic money sits in an institution where staff and boards decide where to spend it. But I think there's three advantages of having it, have the decisions made by the community. And actually in our model, or at least our ambition is to go even beyond participation. So the next step beyond participation, and not just the decisions, are made by the activists within a framework that has already been set by the foundations, but the activists are setting the whole framework. So it's the most radical form, I would say. At least that is what we aim for. So all the decisions are made, taken mainly by the activists, although we also have funders still at the table. So the advantages, why? First of all, because we think it's just a matter of principle. It's a more democratic way and a more fair way to deal with philanthropic money. Who are we as foundation staff to just decide about that alone? Let alone boards that are usually drawn from the European elite and capitalists, etc. Second, we think it's more effective, but this is one of the things we have to test. But if I hear you, there's a good chance that it will be, because we think activists are the ones that know best where funding for activism should go to, is basically as simple as that. And third of all, we think participatory grant-making also has this connecting power. Through being together, being part of this, we also connect better the scene and the activists from different places in Europe. So those are the three advantages and the reasons why we do it. Well, then who is involved? Very briefly. As I said, the initiative was not just from foundations. As of the beginning, it has been a conversation between activists and funders. First between us and our community of activists, Open Society Initiative for Europe and their community, Charles Leopold Meyer and their community. And then at some point we noticed those conversations started to overlap within the programs we already had at that time. Then we're talking about 2014, 2015, and at some point at the meeting of the Edge Funders Alliance, which is a progressive alliance of funders who strive for systemic change, 4 foundations decided to pool funding. It's not a huge amount now, it's like 200,000 euros, which is not bad, but for the whole of Europe it's not so much, but it's a pilot, so we hope it will grow. And from that moment on, we had several meetings with mainly activists and some funders deciding together how this fund could be implemented. Now, this is the end of the presentation. If you want to become active within Fund Action, because it's a pilot, it's not yet open for everyone, but it's on invitation. But if you are really interested, you can ask me and I can see if someone has some invitations left, because the activists who were involved so far have these invitations. But also you can just contact Fund Action, and I think the address is also contact@fundaction.eu. So just check out our website, fundaction.eu. And you can come into touch with with us, and soon this will be open for everybody. And I can say something about challenges as well.
Yeah, cool, thank you. So we have a ton to dig into. I'll take 2 quick minutes before that to introduce myself, which I realized in my jet lag I totally failed to do. So I guess I should explain why I'm here, and then we'll move into discussion. So I work for an organization called Foundation Center based in New York. We've been around 60 plus years, and actually were born out of the McCarthy era hearings in the United States when there was actually a lot of distrust in foundations and what they were doing and where they were giving money to. So we were actually formed by a bunch of the large foundations in the States as a transparency vehicle to house the data of who's funding what and where, and otherwise communicate what foundations are up to, so that there's not so much this cloud over what foundations are up to. So since then, we've not only been the clearinghouse of data for the field, but we've also done a lot of research on practices and trends in philanthropy. So I actually run a platform called Grantcraft, which is where funders can share their wisdom with one another and theoretically learn from each other. I say theoretically because every foundation thinks it's its own special snowflake in a sense, and so that sort of peer learning is always easier said than done. But we believe through the power of data and communication that we can actually share knowledge. Before that, I actually worked at a private foundation that did some participatory practices, but was not a participatory grant maker. But before that, I actually, in college, took a course that was called Experiments in Philanthropy, and it was funded by Doris Buffett, who is Warren Buffett's lesser talked about sister, even though she's a very cool lady. And she had this idea that what if we invite youth, starting with college students, but actually now it's as young as 8 years old, to make grants in their college communities. So I was part of a pilot classroom that's now in more than 100 schools where we made grants in our community. And so I was a participatory grant maker. And so now, full circle, I'm researching the topic. And so that's what brings me here today. So I have some of my own perspectives on the benefits of participatory grant making, but you guys have covered a ton of them. Just to recap some of what we heard, it's impossible to know what to fund otherwise. Like, how would we know what a good investment is without asking people? It's good to build discourse within a movement and within a population, and I also heard building discourse in the broader community. I heard collaboration as a core value and bringing together people that might otherwise work in a silo. I heard strengthening collaboration and capacity as a really big thing, where something about the agency of all the participants being able to have voice and take a leadership role in these processes. And something that you said that I want to come back to and kind of ask the group about is you said, we think it's more effective. We think it's overall more effective. And so I kind of want to dig into that benefit a little bit and ask each of you just to share your thoughts on, like, how do you know it's effective? And if you don't know, why do you believe it's effective? Whoever would like to start.
So we just started, the first call is open now, but we don't have evidence yet. So I will just tell you how we are going to evaluate this. So if you remember, we had this, what is it, 6 or 7 values here. And those are the basis of our evaluation. So for each value, we identified an objective, and then we identified how to measure that, both for, let's say, the activist community in Europe, for the philanthropic sector, because we also have an aim to promote this type of funding within the philanthropic sector, and also for society as a whole. So it's maybe not very quantitative way of measuring, but really trying to, through in-depth interviews and through an analysis of what's happening on the online platform, a way to find out if what we do is actually contributing to those values we have identified.
Yeah, I wanted to look at this idea of effective as from the other side, that if only funders decided what needs to be funded, which is actually comes out of multiple influences from all over, half of which are not even contextual to where the funding is going into, the arts and culture community is left doing projects that have absolutely no meaning or value for them. And therefore, they're not effective. They're just doing it just to survive. They're just doing it because that's the in thing. some global organization has set a pattern, and then the local funders are picking up on those trends. So it becomes trendy funding. But the actual projects have most often absolutely no value or meaning in the lives of people who make them or in the life of people who are experiencing them. To that extent, I think it's more effective when you look for when you figure out the agenda and what it should be from people. But there's another thing that I think is linked to it, and it's very basic, that it's a kind of, I think, donor education or advocacy, that just because you have the money does not mean you know the best. And it's a very basic principle, that just because you have the resources does not necessarily give you the knowledge or experience to decide what would be the best for the field. So that distinction, I think that's been very important, as well as effective philanthropy for us.
Well, from the perspective of Clubture, it's we set our rules by ourselves, and we include everybody who is interested in participating, every new organization that is interested in participating. Effectiveness is then defined by us. And so far, the community has decided that they want to continue, and they don't want to become a boys' club, exclusive place where, 5 organizations or 15 or 50, never mind, play their own game. So I would say that it is effective in, that would be my personal estimation, that it is effective. But also what I talked about benefits outside of this specific program is that building of trust that proved to be very effective in several crisis situations in Croatia, where the organizations from the network managed to summon the energy and kind of and the knowledge to either prevent some measures that were what is the name? Bad for. I can't come up with the English word. Detrimental for the cultural field, or some to kind of propose some new policies and push them with enough strength to form certain mechanisms within policy mechanisms for the development of the scene. So I think that when we talk about effectiveness, we don't have to talk only about the audience. Of course, we can talk about statistics, and I think what is amazing thing about culture collaboration and program platform that Clubture proposes is decentralization that is really happening. And we can measure that. We can measure that now as opposed to 15 years ago, and we can attach it to what Clubture does. But I don't think that is really the effectiveness that we are talking about. For me, the same thing, or the same strength has the fact that we are the ones who, among our members, have organizations from such small towns that actually have only one independent cultural organization, and that one independent cultural organization participates in this broader network and shares their program throughout the whole country. So for me, that's equally relevant as the mobilization of the whole scene for a certain policy goal or whatever. So that's effectiveness.
So something I heard not explicitly mentioned in any of your answers, but I want to drill into this a little bit, is the role of transparency. And I'm curious if transparency is a benefit of participatory grant making, or if it's a means that you need to use in the process, or maybe it's both. What is transparency?
I'll attempt. I guess it's both, because in most cases, in foundations which support arts and culture, you just hear of the decisions. One day, you see on their website that these are the 10 grants that have been made. There is nothing on their website about how they came upon making those grants. And there's nothing in that public announcement that talks about any process of decision-making either. The reject emails that most people get also do not speak about the process. It's either a good letter that you've got it, or, sorry, you haven't, we regret to inform you. So it remains completely opaque to public view, or also within the community. When you use some of these processes which have participation of different publics, in any case, you're opening up sort of warts and all. You're just opening up your processes with its mistakes and failures and everything to a larger circle of participants. And that itself is transparent. That process itself is transparent. And then it's important for you to communicate that in all your public announcements, that this is the process, these are the people. So the responsibility also of having made those choices is divided collectively across the board, in the sense, across the board of participants who were part of that decision-making. So it's a bit of both, I think.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Great. I have 1,000 more questions, so that's fine. Something. Oh,
sorry,
yep,
maybe it's not really an answer to your question, but something that really I completely agree with, sharing the process, etc. Just one challenge that I wrote down beforehand relates to transparency, and that's specifically probably, or maybe not, for if your target group is activists, because it's not always easy to be completely transparent about what you do when it comes to activism. Especially when it comes to countries with more restrictive regimes, but even in like democracies, or so-called democracies, whatever, it can sometimes be tricky to be completely transparent because, if you give away the process during the process, then you might give some information that you don't want to give. So we are struggling a bit with how to deal with that. That's why for now it's a closed group and we can test it, and then we can see how we deal with that later.
That's a really nice lead-in to the question I was going to ask next about power dynamics, because I think that that's really embedded in what you were just describing, where ultimately when you work for a foundation or you work for a nonprofit organization that is the organizing partner of a platform like this, you have power. There's inherent power there. And even when you're shifting decision-making power to constituents, you still are theoretically providing a framework and providing a way of interaction. And so I think power dynamics aren't necessarily a challenge per se, but they could be. So how do you all think about power dynamics in your work, and what do you do about them? Please.
Because this is a very interesting question for me, and also one where we still disagree within the facilitation group, because I strongly believe that power doesn't go away just by not addressing it. So we can, like some people in the development stage of the fund would say, like, if the foundations just step out completely and they wouldn't be at the table anymore, then we don't have to deal with this issue of what is the role of the foundations and the funders. So that would be much easier because then everyone is equal. Well, I was one of the persons, and actually mostly the activists involved had the same opinion, while the funders were more like, ooh, let's just step out, and we cannot be blamed that we execute power too much. But I agreed with the activists who said, it's better to be at the table and to, as you said, to be also in this learning process. That you are the one with the money, but that doesn't mean you have the power. So you are at the table, but in a much more modest role than you would normally be, and I think that's very good for the foundation staff to learn, and also it gives much more opportunities to then eventually change the rest of your foundation, because this is just, in our case, a small portion of our total funding, and the philanthropic sector as a whole. Because if you're not involved at all, it's basically just giving a grant to a platform that's re-granted, like if we would give a grant to Clubture. But I mean, not that it's a bad thing to give a grant to Clubture, but you know, that's for us not participatory grant making, because then you do that, but for us it's just giving a grant. So if you're involved yourself, you're really forced to rethink your whole systems, all your systems.
Well, not being a grant-making organization and being very horizontal and extremely democratic, we have rules, and we make them and we change them. And every organization is one vote. Everybody who is there is, I mean, given the time and the space to suggest the changes. Sometimes the whole group agrees with the changes. Sometimes we deliberate on them for years, like assembly meeting in and out. But then that is the basic constitution of the organization. So yeah, nothing really. I mean, power dynamics can arise among the members themselves, but they are kind of completely marginalized by the model itself. So I don't remember any meeting in which the loudest person won or whatever, and especially because the decision making is very collective. Yeah, it's probably way out of the power dynamics.
Yeah, it's been of concern to us for a long time that how do you really, you have the power. There's no point, like you said, you can't run away from it. You are the foundation that is making the grants. But one of the things that we've figured is probably putting yourself constantly in positions of vulnerability is a good thing. It's a learning, it's listening really. So one thing we started about 3 years ago is doing these IFA open houses across the country, where you go to a city, you have a local partner who sets it up for you, and you basically sit and listen to people complain about you. It might sound strange, but it's great actually, because as program staff and as members of the foundation who do have this position of power, it's a nice lesson to listen to what you're doing with mistakes and what and not immediately respond or defend, but take it all in, bring it back. And practically, I've seen that sort of changes the way in which you are seen in the field, as well as how you see yourself. It sort of strips you off that sense of power in multiple ways. But it's also difficult because there's a lot of paucity of funds, lack of funds, in the arts and culture in India. So, and there's a competition in the field among the participants for those limited funds. So how much of truth is actually coming at you is always a question, because there are always, relationships that people are building and dynamics that are forming across. So it's a very difficult area to wade through.
Thanks. I have a bunch more questions, but I want to actually see if anyone in the audience does, and I see there's one there. Do we have a floating mic or? Cool. And if folks could just say their name and before they ask their question or make their comment.
Okay. Hi, I am Tornia from Cooperativa, regional platform for culture. I actually would like to hear more about the methodology of decision-making in the grants Menno is talking about, this new program. So who is deciding about the applications? And another thing, Do you see a meeting point or a space of intertwining between the model Clubture is developing and the one you are developing? So how do these two situations meet, since somehow Clubture is a non-grant making body but still operating with these certain funds needs money to enable the exchange among the actors, and somehow without support or encouragement from those who dispose with funding, its sustainability is questionable. And on the other hand, so institutions like ECF or IFA are interested in developing this more horizontal and inclusive models. So how do these two different approaches meet? Since, for example, in a certain sense, the Clubture model, as I understand it and see it, also has a certain moment of self-valorization, because when you're evaluating other projects, but your project is competing too. So in that sense, you also have a certain kind of competitiveness, but also critical approach towards what you do. Okay, thank you.
So how do we evaluate the proposals? It depends a bit. It was also a big discussion, and it depends a bit on the type of grant. But now, for the grant scheme that's currently open, this sort of exchange and capacity building grants, it's by voting. So we have an online assembly on which all the members have an account, and they can put their proposals there. It always needs to be 2 or more members. And then if we are now looking into if we have enough. If not, we might open the opportunity to have 1 member and 1 non-member applying together. And then people can just vote for the different proposals, and then depending on the total budget available, there will be sort of distribution of funding in that way. Personally, I find it a bit problematic to only vote, because it's not really an in-depth way of assessing a proposal. I would rather see more conversation and less points and numbers. These are small grants that are mainly like internal, like from within the community, so probably it's okay. But I'm sure for this grants focused on systemic change that are larger, it would be good to have like people really discussing them, like this review panels I was talking about, that are randomly selected based on a diversity of gender, ethnic, and also of like background, like sector. To discuss and to try to achieve consensus rather than just raising hands like I like it or I don't like it. For me, it's a bit superficial. And your other question, I also forgot to say, I wanted to say in my presentation that the model of fund action is based on different already existing models, and Clubture was actually one of them, but also Frida, the feminist fund, and the Red Umbrella Fund for the sex workers, and also very important, the Ash Fund UK, which is a small fund for grassroots activists in the UK. So we looked at what their practices, and I for sure forget to mention many others as well, to see what would work for us. It's a bit different context, because what the ones I mentioned are either like broad but in one specific local context, like Clubture, or they are for a much more specific target group, like only for sex workers. It's global, but while I found action is both for a very broad target group and in quite a big region all over Europe. I think on the long term, it might be that we go more towards a model which is similar to Clubture. That would be the moment the foundations sort of step out, because it's, they would keep funding it, but maybe they wouldn't stay forever like involved in the other way, or other foundations step in. And then it would be more similar to Clubture, because it's a sort of, the community itself completely dealing with everything, and also self-evaluating, etc. But I think it's good to set certain structures first together. I don't know. One more thing I wanted to say. No, I forgot. Maybe you can say something about Clubture as well, about how this model's. Yeah, I mean, no? Okay.
I saw another person with the microphone, and then we have a bunch of other hands. So maybe what I'll do actually is I'd love to hear your question, and then we'll pass the microphone back to the woman behind you. So we'll take 2 questions at a time. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll pass it up front then, and then to the back. Okay. Everyone will have a turn. It'll be glorious.
Yes? Okay. My name is Vania. I'm from Portugal, Costume Museum in the Algarve. I will take part of the talk show tomorrow, and I will have a poster outside for you. But I just would like to share something. It's a bit different, but it's part of the same subject. We have been developing management model that we call layers of cultural participation. There we try to represent the way we work, because the museum belongs to a charity, and it's very limited employees, budget, and so on. And we work basically with the community. So we have 4 layers of this cultural participation, including the arts group. I could explain in more detail, but I'm not going to take your time. Tomorrow you can have a look at the poster. Just to say, we don't apply for grants. We have to generate our own funds. We must remain sustainable, and and to keep being an important asset to the community. I think when the community feels that the museum belongs to them, it's their thing. They will work to make it survive. And we have about 9 different groups, and we have 30 different activities running, and it's all community. It's a theater group, a choir, music, arts, photography, many different things. So sometimes we see things as problems, but maybe we should see them as challenges and to find a creative solution. And in this small town, people are very dedicated to their museum, and we have the Friends of the Museum, which is actually running all these cultural activities. And there's other ways. Sometimes the funding is not available, and people, oh my God, so bad, no funding. There's ways, and especially the community. That's the most important asset we have. People, and people willing to do things and to get together and to give their time. Volunteers, they're all volunteers. There's only 3 people working in the museum, staff. And they can do so much. We organize festivals, we organize all sorts of things. So just to leave a hope here that it's not all about the funding or applying for grants, but there's other ways. And it's just our neighbors, the neighbors to the museum, the community where we are, that we have to make the difference in their life. And they can also make the difference in the museum. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And I think something I want to pull out of your comment just quickly is there are organizations that view the people who are consumers as just that, consumers or users or attendees or butts in a seat, as we heard in an earlier presentation. And then there are organizations that see people as assets, and I think that that's what you just named, and I think that that's very core to this ethos. So thanks for sharing that. And if you could just pass the mic up, perfect.
I would like to just make 2 comments and in a certain way questions.
Tell us who you are, please. And turn the mic on somehow, maybe. Was it on?
It's green. Okay. One is, paradoxically, because I'm too old, And I remember how Kultura Nova was created. It was created after one very similar program of European Cultural Foundation and Open Society Fund, which was joint program capacity building of independent organizations in the region, but totally non-participatively created from above, and created not with community, but with clients, let's say. So Croatian and Serbian cultural organizations has been kind of capital city or big cities organization, Macedonia, another story and so on. And the program was conceptualized up there, not in the region. But then we made a rebellion, and we, how it say, insisted that British experts should leave the program and that we are going, and now I'm going to use the word, to self-govern the program. And that's my basically second part of my story, which is, and then the organization who went through Kultura Nova of European Cultural Foundation, Croatian ones, created their Kultura Nova Foundation, using positive and negative experiences of the Kultura Nova capacity building program. So it became really self-governed organization, which I think is very much different than participatory governance. It's self-governance, and that's something else. And that's the story I want to tackle, is why we here in Croatia forget about 10 years of self-governing experience, of self-governing community of interest, where community of cultural worker and community of user was deciding about fund distribution. Don't think that I'm nostalgic or that I, see things better than they are. I deliberately say 10 years because it worked 10 years and then it became routinized, bureaucratized, and the power from the community went in the hands of bureaucrats in this self-governing community of interest. So that's another issue which I want to raise. How we avoid, we in foundations, clientelism. This example, for example, from European Cultural of Activists, for me was problematic in several issues because it is closed. It is based on already existent links of ECF and Open Society and two other foundations with certain activists. But please, activists are not community. They are not sex workers themselves. They are those who deal with sex workers, with, with the people oppressed from repressed people, people with special needs, etc., etc. So I mean, that's something else. Those are, I assume, and that's my another question. So one is related to clientelism, another is related, are they activists themselves as persons or as representatives of their organizations that are coming, voting, participating? Because that also might be totally different. I'm not saying what would be better or worse. It has advantages in both sense. But I think, and just to finish, that on the example, which in the region is going to be very understandable, Student Cultural Center in the center of Belgrade and Student Cultural Center in the student campus. Two institutions, both self-governed and both governed by community of students. And I was participating in both because I was delegate of my Faculty of Drama to both. What was the first one was elitist institution, although self-governed, and the other one was populist. And you look theater program, and how that was not tackled in the previous debate, But when we really want to hear community of non-experts, how then we avoid populism? In the case of Cultura Nova, it's not the question because they are all experts, because they are all organizations that do. But in some other areas and fields, if we really speak about participatory and so on, we might end up that what people need, what community need, for example, now in Serbia, the most happy community is in city of Jagodina because they have wellness, aqua parks, zoos, and whatever. That's it. And they're really, when they measure happiness of citizens, they are happy, not those who have cultural provisions.
Thank you. There's a lot embedded there that we don't have time to respond to everything, but does anyone on the panel want to respond to some aspect of that? And then we'll move into a group reflection.
Yeah, a lot of things. First of all, on this closed character of fund action, I was also not in favor of this, but it was for practical reasons in this pilot phase to not let it grow too fast. But soon it will be open for everyone. So the condition for entering, and that tackles then directly your question about populism, the condition for entering is to subscribe the values we have identified. And I think that's not a very strict condition. But on the other hand, we sort of try to, with those values, making clear that that is what we stand for, to sort of prevent that the groups that we don't want to support will enter and take over the platform. Then, what else? Yeah, they are individuals. And of course, many of those individuals do work for organization, but they are a member of the platform as individuals. This was, by the way, also a big discussion how to deal with this in the establishment phase. And the last point was, sorry, I got up really early this morning to take my flight, so my memory is not working perfectly. No, populism I tackled because with the values, but okay, thank you.
I think given timing, what we'll do, I put this reflection up here. You can reflect during the coffee break so that we can take 2 more questions. Does that sound okay? Yes, great. Someone has the microphone. Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Maybe just a thought and a question to Jen. In terms of a thought, I feel most of the discussions were mostly on the decision to fund. I feel in terms of participation, we may need also to look at even the criteria, even the process, even the way we constitute, even the eligibility, because I'm looking at, for example, the European Cultural Foundation. Obviously, the rules of establishment are already set up, and maybe people have no say in those rules or even the eligibility and the criteria of it. But most of the discussions were mostly on the decision just to fund, which I think is really at the end of the whole process. It would be good to also get a bit more, especially when we interface with the foundations, you find that sometimes the criteria, the rules, the reporting procedure is so tedious such that, and you have no say in that. You may have a say in the decision itself, but if you have no say in the whole process, it's a bit of a challenge. And a question to Jen, in terms of, I understand how this can work for community or public grant-making institutions, but I don't know how it would sit with private ones which have very specific goals. For example, I mean, as the Foundation Center, I know you deal with you deal with some sort of private foundations which have said we want our funds to be used in this way and that way. How are there any examples of some using some participatory methods to sort of allow the process to be a bit more open? Thank you.
Great question. I'm going to answer that, but after we take one last question so that we can kind of answer all at once. Did someone else? Oh, maybe I saw a ghost hand.
Were you on the list? Okay, that's right. Hello, my name is Pedro, and I'm from Brazil, one of the countries I think which started with participatory budget, and I've been currently living in Germany, and on Friday I'm going to present an article specifically related to balance of power and the time that this balance of power somehow takes to occur. And my question, it's an open question, and it's regarding 2 points. The time, that it's an important factor when you are implementing a participatory process that you need to discuss, you need to list, and you need to inform to make it transparent. And then it takes 1, 2, 3, 6, 1 year, right? And in some occasions, decisions need to be taken within a certain time frame. And also the size of participation. What do I mean by the size of participation? We are talking about different values for grants, and when you have a high value and when you have many biddings, you need to have naturally a higher amount of people working in the granting make institutions to take the decision of who is going to be granted that particular value. So it's the time and the size. Do you think that participation somehow has a size, or a size that can be handled by that particular grant or things like that? Otherwise, you would take a long time that wouldn't really be suitable for the time frame that you have. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to just go down the row here on anyone who wants to come in on either of those 2 questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, maybe I can answer on the time question, because it is really problematic. And on the size, I can't estimate the maximum size, because now we are 55 organizations, and I could imagine that we can run like this for 100 organizations as well. But the time is a factor, and it is within our network constant thing that we try to kind of improve the rules and try to improve the process so it's not that much time consuming. On the other hand, it's not only the time, it's also physical space. What we figured out so far is that people need to meet. And I know it's a very basic thing, but it is something that is important for those people and for the network and for the discussion, because there's only as many things that you can facilitate online. So yeah, time is a factor, and I can't imagine this process with 3,000 people. But on the other hand, then the process becomes more complex, and probably you come up with the new rules and new models. I think what is really good about working this way, bottom up, is that you grow with your model grows with the network. So at the moment when it becomes a problem, then we will tackle with that. I think theoretically, dealing with that at this point, when we still can get hold of all of them, it's not really fruitful.
I would think it would depend on what is the decision. and what that decision's impact is going to be, for how long and how important it is, and the time and size would depend really on that. So for example, if we are looking at reviewing one of our grant programs to shape it into something new and more relevant and something that's more attuned to what the field needs, we wouldn't mind spending 7 months with layers of participation on it, because that program is going to stay there for the next 5 to 8 years. But you would have, so it's dynamic actually, and it depends on what the implications of those decision-making have on the broader field of funding. I would like to add that there are 2 things that, I should have said this before, 2 things that we constantly look for in the participatory process is criticality and empathy. And I think the combination of these 2 are the hardest to find, even when you're looking at participants who most of the time are competing with each other for that little bit of funding.
Well, first of all, I remember one more thing you said about activism and activists, and that I didn't agree completely with, because you said the activist is not the sex worker, it's someone else who fights for the sex worker. But within Fund Action, we also try to reach those activists that are from the communities that are affected themselves as well, and we consider them as activists as well. So it's not always like the intermediary or the person in between. In terms of time and space, yeah, this will be like many things. That's also a bit still an answer to Antonia's question about the comparison between Clubture and Fund Action. I think many things of the way how Clubture is operating are very interesting, but on a European level, it would be more difficult because it's becoming too large. And a very concrete example, and I have to be short, so I would just leave it to that, is that we have this annual assembly. Apart from the online assembly, we also have a physical meeting. And already now, although we have only less than 100 members so far, we think we cannot have all members there, because yeah, there are certain limitations, and I mean now still probably we can invite everyone and see who is available, and we would still manage. But if in 2 years this is 2,000 people, of course we are not going to spend all our budget on the meeting, because then we have nothing left for grants. Plus it's very unpractical to have a meeting with so many people and to actually make decisions.
And to the question over here, which I have not forgotten about, a lot of great comments, and I'll just give you 2 quick examples from private foundation world that I think are kind of interesting. One is that the Knight Foundation actually does this news media challenge, which is structured as a prize competition. And it actually speaks to the size question as well, because it actually engages thousands of reviewers who participate in this process. And so it's the first time that Knight as a private foundation has tried a sort of participatory process, and it's gone really well. And they're actually, to your comment, they're actually using past applicants and people who participated in the process to reshape the grant guidelines. And I think what I've seen across a lot of participatory grant makers is you have to start somewhere. So oftentimes the pre-grant work, so the definition of guidelines, et cetera, is initially done by a foundation to kind of get a program in motion. But then as they go through a couple of grant cycles and have more participants from the community involved, they take a step back and do a little bit of redefinition. So happy to talk more about other examples after. I know we're well over time, so I want to just ask everyone in 30 seconds or less, because that's all we can afford with the looks I'm getting. What is one sentence that you want to leave everyone with? One thought on your mind? I'll start to give you guys half a second to think. I really want you guys to think about these reflection questions over dinner, et cetera. I find that talking with a partner can really help you think about, like, well, what's the takeaway here? I often do a panel and then I think, so what? Like, what does this mean for me? So I just want to really encourage everyone to do some reflection out loud with someone, maybe someone that you don't know.
Maybe it's a bit cheesy. I will just say our slogan, and nothing about us without us.
Oh, I'm bad with slogans. I really don't know. It's hard work. I think that's the thing. That's when you have to participate, you really need to work with people, and that's not easy. But yeah, it has its own benefits.
Yeah, I'd be uncomfortable leaving just one takeaway or one sentence, because we've talked for 1.5 hours, and I'm sure there's things people will take. But the fact that it's work in progress, it's a continuously evolving process, and sometimes the mistakes are more important than the successes that you have on the way. Yeah, just that.